You are in defiance of the Emperor's law. You cannot hide. You cannot escape. We are judgment. Prepare for sentencing.
Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, The Mighty Bjorn, and today for you folks, I have a brand new Warhammer 40k Wrath and Glory video. Thought I would take some time today to talk about the Adeptus Arbites, and that's mostly because recently it's been announced that they're going to release a Arbites DLC for Warhammer 40k Dark Tide, as well as Rogue Trader is also getting our Arbites DLC known as Lux Imperialis. So I thought it would be a great time to sit here and discuss the judges, the jury, and the executioner of the Imperial Law. But let's start off with a little bit of history, because I think history can be a bit fun. And realistically, when it comes to the judge, jury, and executioner, as I said that, it probably sounded a bit familiar. And that's because, yes, they've essentially ripped off Judge Dredd. Understand that at the time in the late 70s and early 80s, the 2000 AD comic was quite popular within Britain. And particularly, Judge Dredd was a very popular standout character from the 2000 AD comic series. With that being said, in 1985, Games Workshop would actually get a license and release a Judge Dredd TTRPG, which I kind of hope to discuss it here in the future at some point or another. But either ways, a few years later, Arbites gets introduced into Warhammer 40k. And actually, the early Arbites was a lot closer to Judge Dredd than actually the modern day Arbites. No matter which way you look at it, I feel at the end of the day, it worked out great for both Games Workshop and honestly Judge Dredd. But moving on. So when it comes to recruitment, Arbites is typically recruited from Imperial orphans. Usually these are children of basically Imperial heroes, maybe from the Imperial Navy, the Imperial Guard, etc. Basically any branch of the service. And once they are recruited, they are essentially religiously indoctrinated, as well as they go through a series of hard physical and combat training, separating the wheat from the chaff. And my understanding is a lot of this training actually takes place at the Hall of Justice, which also houses the laws of the Imperium. Basically, these are only the important laws of the Imperium. Certain parts of the universe, certain worlds, if you will, might have their own laws and jurisdiction. And typically, the Arbites really doesn't care about those laws. They let that to the local law enforcement. The Arbites is only worried about Imperial law, which is also known as the Lux Imperialis. With that being said, though, the Lux Imperialis is actually really quite heavy. I mean, it's a series of libraries that houses all these books. So they condense it down into what is known as the Book of Judgment. And that is essentially what the Arbites uses as a guide to what laws they are enforcing and what is the punishment said for each law. And that is mostly because, well, there's actually a lot of laws within the Lux Imperialis that actually contradicts itself. So it's, yeah, basically, what are you going to do? Carry a whole building that's got a library in it or a single book? With that being said, though, it's realistically the law is still up to the interpretation of the Arbites themselves. Now, once their training is complete, they are stationed on a world. Typically, these are going to be either hive worlds or forge worlds. Basically, it's going to be a world of some type of importance to the Imperium. and they're going to be more advanced worlds. Now, of course, they operate outside or within the Arbites precinct fortress. And these fortresses are going to vary in style, size, etc. And the amount of Arbites stationed at a precinct is going to also vary. It could be just literally one Arbites. It could be 100 Arbites. Basically, what it comes down to is it comes down to the size of the world, the population, how many precincts. There could be actually multiple precincts, or there could just be one. And these precinct houses will be well-fortified structures and usually with a well-equipped armory. They do actually use, the Arbites actually uses quite a bit of equipment, and they use a wide variety of equipment. Also, finally, when it comes to the precinct fortresses themselves, they're usually stationed at a capital city, usually somewhere relatively close to the planetary governor's palace, or near something of extreme importance.
Nice fucking models!
And essentially, it is from there that they actually enforce the law, which is basically their job, right? And of course, enforcing the law, they could have run-ins with anything from gainers to heretics and so on. But with that being said, Arbites are very feared among the populace. This is kind of one person you don't want to visit from. Much like an Inquisitor, honestly, when looking at the lore, probably getting a visit from an Arbites is worse than an Inquisitor. Now, equipment of the Arbites is actually pretty wide, especially when it comes to weapons themselves. They'll carry various different types of grenades, different types of pistols. They could have bolters. One thing that is standard, though, for sure, is actually their carapace armor. And basically, the style really doesn't vary all that much from one Arbites to the next. Although, based on their rank, there might be a bit of variation. Now, one popular piece of equipment that I do want to point out is actually the shock maul and the suppression shield. It's pretty common you will see Arbites with these tools. Another one, of course, is also the Arbites pattern shotgun. It's like a mainstay. I swear to God, I mean, you will see Arbites with other weapons, but almost every time you see art of Arbites, especially like a group of them, there will be shotguns in the mix of the other weapons. So they definitely love their shotguns. Now, when it comes to transportation, one common piece of transportation that Arbites uses is actually motorcycles, and typically they actually have a motorcycle very similar to what to something very similar to what the Space Marines uses. Another common piece of transportation that is used within the Arbites is also the Rhino, which, once again, I guess I have to cue this up.
Nice fucking models!
Now, something else that is also kind of a mainstay with Arbites is also the Cyber Mastiff. Yes, they use man's best friend, except for they jack them up with steroids and cybernetics to make them even more lethal than dogs already are. And in general terms, they are used as attack dogs to very great effect. Now I'm going to talk about the rank structures of the Arbites, which essentially you start off with the enforcers and the troopers. These are the Arbites that's kind of at the bottom of the food chain. And then you move up to the arbitrators. Realistically, in our modern world, we would kind of look at the arbitrators as more or less sergeants, or duty sergeants, if you will. Then, of course, you have the senior arbitrators, which essentially they move up. Now, these are the proctors, the judges, and the magistrates. And then you start to get into the higher ranks. These are essentially your officers, if you will. You know, kind of like the equivalent of like your lieutenants, your captains, but so on. And essentially, these are high administration positions. And essentially, those ranks are Marshal, Justicar, and Lord Marshal. Now, just a step now, Lord Marshal would be kind of more of an equivalent of like a general, if you will, or a colonel. But then you also have the Grand Provost Marshal. And he's actually one of the High Lords of Terra, or at least he has a seat on the as part of the council, if you will. So I thought that would be pretty useful information to kind of put out there as a generalization of the Adeptus Arbites itself, to kind of give you maybe an idea or an understanding of the Adeptus Arbites. But finally, I do want to take a moment to talk about the Adeptus Arbites for Warhammer 40k Wrath and Glory. And basically, you're going to find them in this book. Also, I typically call it AOA. But you can actually download this book from the Doctors of Doom website. It is a fan-made supplement that is completely free. I didn't make this supplement, but it's definitely a great supplement. I think it's one of the best fan-made supplements out there, although it is a quite chunky supplement. Either ways, you can go grab this for free and use it as a supplement for your Warhammer 40k TTRPG campaign. Either ways, folks, I am going to wrap up today's video at that. Hopefully you all enjoyed it, and thank you very much for tuning in. Have yourselves a wonderful day.
I am the law.